Hi, welcome to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Andy Ferguson, from the Weekly Standard, author of many, many, many brilliant articles over the years. And
three.
Yeah, 3 or 4. I was going to say 4, but yeah. And 3 books, right? The most recently, Crazy You, which we'll talk about a little later on current system of higher education, Land of Lincoln, and then the book of essays from 1996, I think.
Yeah.
Fool's Names, Fool's Faces. Where did that title come from?
Well, it was imposed on me by by my publisher through the agency of P.J. O'Rourke, who wrote the introduction. And I've never quite figured out what it means. The actual
you shouldn't admit that.
Anyway, yes,
right?
it was
you,
my
you
idea.
had a brilliant,
it was my idea, actually.
It's deep. There are many levels to it.
Yes, I just don't know what they are. I'm sure there are many levels, but it's the phrase is from an aphorism that goes, "Fools' names, fools' faces are often seen in public places." The idea being that I think there are a lot of idiots in the world. And the conceit of the book was that it was a series of semi-profiles or discussions of individuals, from Newt Gingrich and Bill Bennett, Donald Trump, and a number of other people who are kind of known for their ridiculousn's. Yeah, I wouldn't say that about Bill Bennett. I should take that back.
I picked it up just a little while ago and hadn't looked at it in a while. It came out just after the Weekly Standard began, as I recall, in '96. Yeah, and I was looking. I had forgotten that there was an essay on Donald Trump, which makes it very topical. It's written in 1990, I think, right?
Probably, yeah, 90 or 91
for the Journal.
Yeah, it was a book review, and it was written. If anybody who's read a good Trump book, that is where he's had somebody who tries to mimic his tone and his cadence and everything, you start reading it and you just get caught up in the rhythms of this, his bombastic phrasing of everything, and everything is an exaggeration, everything's to the extreme. And so when I wrote the review, I thought that probably the easiest way to make fun of it was just to use his tone and his conversational pacing and so on, and so I did, and I thought it was one of the meanest things I'd ever written, and up to that point, but apparently he loved it. He called.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. He called up.
Did he call you, or he called
no,
the Journal?
Saying a good review. Fair. Oh God, I didn't do it then. I mean, if he liked it, then I didn't achieve my objective.
No, I reread it just a couple of weeks ago. It's obvious that you're mimicking him or mocking him, but you do so in a sort of gentle way and in a somewhat kind way. Now, the book cheered me up a lot because these are all essays from 20, 25 years ago about how ridiculous our public life is, and I've been sitting around all year. This year, it's the end of September now, 2016, thinking we've gone totally downhill from some height in the past to this new low in our politics and public life. And reading your books made me think, well, maybe we've always been that way.
Well, I think you can go to any particular era, certainly in American history. You can go back to the 1840s, and there are people lamenting the decline of, Thomas Jefferson, before he died, was lamenting the decline of character and so on. And that was sort of the theme of this book 20 years ago, and if anything, it's just gotten worse. I mean, I don't think that the fact that it's a common trope among social observers that things used to be better and they're worse now invalidates the point.
Right.
So it's not really an argument against saying, God, things are really going to hell, by saying, well, people said that in 1840 and they said it in 1950 and so on. It just may be the fact that things are always going to hell in a handbasket.
So let's talk about that. What is it worse? In what particular way? Is there one thing that jumps out to you? You've been writing about this for 30, really your whole adult life, kind of.
Well, there are lots of different things that are going on that I think weren't going on even 20, 25 years ago. Trump is a perfect embodiment of a kind of decline. I remember Ronald Reagan running in 1980, and people said, my God, this is the end of American politics. You've got a guy who is a bad actor in bad movies and superficial, clearly doesn't know anything. And by God, back in the days of Ike or Roosevelt, you could never tolerate a man like this. And, of course, he turned out to be a fine president and actually quite intelligent person and well-read and so on. I don't think that's going to happen with Trump. I mean, if, God forbid, he was actually the President of the United States, I don't think that we will find that, back of him, as it was back of Reagan, a long trail of books read and ideas going through. And so I think he is
handwritten radio addresses, which he himself edited.
Yeah, and which are actually very, very well written.
Right.
And I just don't think that that's going to be the case with Trump. Trump is Reagan was a creature of fame, obviously. He wouldn't have gotten into politics, or he couldn't have achieved what he achieved in California politics had he not already been famous and very good looking and well-spoken and so on. But Trump has taken pure fame, which is to say well-knownness, fame without any particular achievement behind it, And so it's almost as though there's like nothing behind the celebrity, and that's different from the way it used to be.
I guess that became, though, a theme of critics even in the 60s, 50s. I want to say famous for being famous. Didn't Daniel Boorstin write is it a book or an essay, Celebrity? Something along.
Yeah, he has a wonderful essay on celebrity, and
I should go back and look at that. Actually, I thought about that until this minute.
Actually, he wrote some amazing things, anticipating what was going to happen, and he coined the term pseudo event too.
Is that
which
right?
Is
so. This is Daniel, Daniel Boorstin, the American historian,
a great historian,
who was then
and then
Librarian of Congress.
Librarian of
right?
Congress for Reagan appointed him, in fact,
and died about 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, and really a very impressive guy. And, wonderful, wonderful writer, and I guess a very good historian if I were able to judge that. But he coined this term pseudo-event because he noticed in the late 50s that the press conference, for example, was a new thing. That is, an event totally manufactured just to create news. And it was done with, of course, the cooperation of reporters and people in the journalism business. And so he thought, isn't it odd that they can actually create an event that is an event just to be covered for the sole purpose of getting publicity. And of course now we are so far beyond that. I mean, there are layers upon layers of falsity that have gone on top of the pseudo event. Now we're at the stage of pseudo events, I think.
I guess was TV really the break? I mean, we hadn't really thought about this again until now, but you do think that somehow the television and mass television was a moment where, democracy went to a whole nother level of...
It was truly a mass phenomenon, unlike anything. I mean, there was... Movies, of course, were visual, but to see a movie, you had to get up, go to the movie theater, and then you had to leave, and so on. The TV was something that came right into your home.
And was live.
And,
could be live.
I'm very interested in the fact, I was thinking about this the other day, even now with... of course, the saturation of the internet in everybody's lives and its ability to convey information, which has just really taken over everything else. I still believe that TV trumps, if you'll excuse the phrase, everything. TV fame is unlike internet fame, with all due respect to the medium. You can't get famous as quickly and as enduringly as you can on television. I mean, there are all these things, YouTube, celebrities, and so on. But to achieve a fame that will last, say, maybe 3 weeks, as opposed to 48 hours, television is still, you just can't beat it.
I guess movies before that were extremely big, but that was, again, you'd see a movie by someone every 6-9 months, and television's every week or every day if you're a newscaster.
Yeah. And again, it wasn't ubiquitous in a way. I mean, you didn't have Clark Gable in your house every day.
The key.
Whereas you do, unfortunately, have Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in your house every day.
And you don't think this is a good thing for America, civilization, communication, more knowledge, all the things that people use to justify,
It's interesting to think, if you could combine television fame and Aristotle, that would be one thing. But television can't do that. You can't screw Aristotle into television. Television, by its nature, rewards people like Donald Trump, and I just don't. It's a marvelous medium in a number of different ways. I mean, you can still convey lots of information, and you can make experience is immediate in ways that you can't through other media, but it still has demands on the people who exploit it, and basically the more superficial, the better.
And I guess what's changed, but you should discuss this, not me, is, I mean, somehow it seems like when we were younger, there was television and that culture, but then there were other cultures, high culture and intellectual culture, university culture. Not that they were all so great, God knows, but
right.
And it's sort of the swallowing up of all the others by the mass culture.
Yes, yeah, the kind of flattening of everything. You know, I always think about public television. You know, when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was launched in the 60s as part of the Great Society, E.B. White wrote a wonderful essay, slightly pretentious, about how we were going to rise or fall on the strength of television. And here finally was the promise of television being fulfilled, because it was going to be public, it was going to be guided by intelligent people, it wasn't going to appeal to the lowest common denominator, and so on and so on. And of course now you turn on a PBS station and you're likely to see doo-wop groups. So it just doesn't, because of television and the mass saturation that it allows, there just wasn't room for high culture anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know, you remember when we were kids, Leonard Bernstein had these marvelous series, which are still available on DVD, series explaining classical music,
Right.
Young people's concerts. They would give in Carnegie Hall, and they'd tape them. And of course, he was so charismatic and wonderful to watch. That was just sort of kind of standard fare. It was expected that intelligent people should take responsibility for what they're doing by putting it on television. And now I don't think anybody feels that compulsion.
Yeah, no, it's striking. One of my favorite essays in this book, which I should say is, of course, available on
For a penny.
Amazon. Yeah, for one set, that's what I paid. I mean, but it's 1 penny, but then it's
worth every
but
penny.
What about
and
the
it's only
$3.98 shipping? That's really. I hate paying more for shipping. There's nothing wrong with paying more for shipping than for
I
the
don't
book.
get a cut of the shipping. Oh,
That's good. You get a cut of the pennies. Anyway, it's a very fine book. You can buy it new and pay more and get a nicer copy. But one of the great essays in that book, and they really are terrific, all of them, is the essay about your being on television with. Do you remember which one I'm talking about?
Jennifer Flowers.
Yes.
Yes, who was the first of, to use the phrase that Clinton people used, of the bimbos who erupted as Bill Clinton ran for president in 1992. And
that seems quaint, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I remember all of us. Well, you and I were in the Bush White House at that time. You spent a year or so away from journalism, writing speeches. We should talk about that in a minute. But for President Bush, and we thought, well, that could kill his campaign.
I remember when the
imagine?
story broke. I walked into the office of my boss, Tony Snow, who's the late Tony Snow, and I said, "Mr. Clinton, he dead." And Tony said, "I'm not so sure."
Sorry.
And Tony, of course, was right. But Jennifer Flowers managed to achieve this astonishing celebrity, and she posed for Penthouse magazine and all these sorts of things. And so I was asked to be on a show, kind of an Oprah knockoff, up in New York, and I went on with, I think it was Jacob Weisberg, who was then at the New Republic, and a woman named Jane First, who was a reporter for the New York Daily News.
So this is what, like in '98, I think, during impeachment or something like that?
Yeah. She kind of kept trying to find ways to angle her way back into the spotlight, and impeachment was one of those. And she also had a book coming out, which of course is important. So it was sort of Jacob and Jane on one side and me and Jennifer on the other side. I didn't really quite realize that we were supposed to be a tag team, and I was supposed to be her journalistic defender.
As the anti-Clinton sort of.
Yeah. Anyway, so right before a break, Jane First was kind of insulting poor Jennifer, and she said to her, he said, well, I can't remember what the claim was. She said, well, if you believe that, Jane First said, well, then, you'll think that Jennifer Flowers is a natural blonde. And people went, whoo, and they cut and they go to the commercial. And I could feel the heat radiating off of Jennifer Flowers. And she slowly rose out of her chair and walked over to Jane and stuck her face in Jane's face and said, "Now listen, I have never claimed to be a real blonde, but I can tell you this. My tits are real." And I thought, is she going to, sort of...
This was not on air, unfortunately.
This was on the break, alas.
That's too bad, yeah.
And of course, the audience didn't get to hear it. I think she would have won over many more sympathizers to her side if they'd been able to hear her make that claim.
God.
So I wrote it up, actually, and the whole event, and mentioned that line. And it went out over the New York Times wire. And Jennifer was so pleased by the story that in her next book, she wrote about how really had only been one defender in the media of her dignity, and it was Andy Ferguson of the New York Times.
Oh.
And so I thought, well, I never really wanted to work for the New York Times, and now I'll never work for the New York Times. So.
They didn't insist that the publishers issue a correction, destroy the book.
Yeah, or at least an errata.
Yeah, it's slip, right? Yeah, that's an old-fashioned idea. I wouldn't have those anymore. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I remember when you came to the Bush White House. We should talk about that a little. You were a journalist your whole life, really, and then you took that. Was it about a year and a half? I can't remember now.
Just a year.
A year.
Yeah. Exactly, from January 15th, 1992, when he was running for election, to whatever it was, January 15th, 1993, when they kicked us out.
And how did you come into? Who asked you? How did you become a speechwriter?
John Sununu. The call came from John Sununu, but I think Tony Snow, who had been hired as the chief speechwriter. Tony was actually at the time quite prominent columnist and TV personality, a very good guy. I think Tony had kind of put Sununu up to it. John Sununu was the chief of staff for President Bush. This is the first President Bush, of course, not the second.
And you were where when at this point?
I was at Scripps Howard newspapers.
Writing editorials.
In the Washington Bureau, yeah.
Right.
And so, I'd always wanted to see sort of what the world looked like from that vantage, and I thought it could only help me as a journalist. And so I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. And it was, before I'd been there 2 weeks, Tony had been fired.
Yeah, I remember that, right? It was you came in. I was there as Quail Chief of Staff, so I was watching this from, so to speak, a little bit of
I haven't
remove.
counted in a while, but I think by May of that year, I'd had 5 different bosses.
Wow.
You'll remember, President Bush was running for re-election, had no real rationale for his re-election. His heart didn't really seem to be in it.
He'd been a good president, especially in foreign policy, but the Cold War was over. So.
Yeah, the Cold War was over, and he was the last of the World War II generation, which actually is one of the things that made me so proud to work for him. He was a genuine war hero. And so I always said, when they hired me in January, Bush's approval rating was, I think, at 48, and by March I'd gotten it down to 32.
Right.
And it just felt like that. You were in free fall the whole time. And so there was this churning of bosses. And at one point, they only had 2 speechwriters left for the president writing not only his speeches as president, but also the stuff that he would use in his campaign. So it was chaos, and I would never do it again, but I would never trade that experience for anything.
Wasn't there some guy who came in, we don't have to mention his name, but there's after Tony, who was kind of a highbrow, I would say, director of speechwriting, interested in conservative ideas.
Tony had us meet with Tom Wolfe and other writers.
The brains of serious people. And then there was some guy who was brought in who was more from the advertising world. I actually don't remember his name, so we don't even have to say it here. But
right, he had worked for a PR firm in a large corporation, and sort of wrote in jingles. Hardly ever used a complete sentence, but then President Bush hardly ever used a complete sentence. I remember I used to joke that I was the speechwriter in charge of pronouns, so my stuff never got used, because the joke was that the president hated to say I or me or my or anything. It was part of the Yankee upbringing from his mother, who told him never to talk about himself, which is a real liability if you're running for office. So he would kind of speak in these fragments. And this, to his credit, the guy from the large corporation understood that about him and got into the cadence that Bush had. There was a kind of natural cadence that he used, and he was very good. And Bush ended up just absolutely loving him.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they weren't very effective speeches somehow, I think, maybe.
They were not. They were not the deepest speeches. But again, I mean, we were entering a phase where big, deep speeches weren't called for.
Right. I just remember being Quail Chief of Staff, and you remember they used to circulate this was it pre-email? I guess it really was.
Yeah, you could have
internal thing.
intranet in the White House.
But they circulated the drafts of the speeches to senior staff, so everyone could just read it, catch a mistake, or suggest an improvement, obviously. And
every speechwriter hates that process
yes,
more than anything.
Right. So you needed some character from some other office saying, "Hey, Al, I think you should do this.
Yeah.
What about this issue? My favorite pet ridiculous issue." Yeah.
Right.
But I do remember the change from fairly kind of fairly highbrow and political rhetoric, but still speeches that Tony and his team were doing to these somewhat jingly, as you say, things that literally you'd look at them. And it was written sort of like jingles, right? I mean, the paragraphs were not somehow.
Oh, he used ellipses.
Yes, that's right.
He wouldn't use a complete sentence, and he would connect them by ellipses. And again, it was ingenious because it really did appeal to the president's sense of verbal rhythm. This was the way that he communicated, and it was effective to the degree that it pleased him, and which is not an inconsiderable thing.
Didn't get him reelected, however. Didn't keep us. We both
No.
were out of work on January. We were both out of work on January 20th, 1993, I think.
No. And I look back.
Did you deal with him much? I mean, how much access did you really have to him personally?
Well, the speechwriting shop had been explicitly downgraded in '88 and '89 when
by contrast with Reagan.
Yes, to set up a contrast with Reagan. Reagan was showbiz. Reagan was all glitz and all that kind of stuff. But we were doing the hard work of governing, and so speechwriters who had actually held a fairly good, fairly high up status in the Reagan White House were then demoted, and people were hired who didn't really have much experience, and Sununu wanted that to be a symbol of the changing of the guard, that we were now past the Reagan age, and we were now into the Bush era. And I remember talking to a guy, I wasn't there at the time, but the people who were taking over the White House after kicking all the Reagan people out when Bush was elected, saying, the Reagan era is just going to be thought of as the prelude to the Bush era. And maybe you have to convince yourself of things like that when you go to work for a president, but I thought it was absurd at the time, and it was, obviously.
And what did you learn from that experience? You said you always wanted to do it, to see it from the inside. Any sort of...
Well, I learned that government policy is created in chaos. And if I was never given to conspiracy theories, but if I had been, it would have disabused me of any inclination like that. The idea that government can operate efficiently enough, say, to orchestrate the assassination of John F. Kennedy or whatever the crazy conspiracies are, is just absurd. And so much of the way a policy takes place is through personal considerations. Mrs. Bush used to have this phrase, what happens in your house is much more important than what happens in the White House. And that is kind of a clever phrase. And I remember saying what happens in the men's room is much more important than what happens in the speechwriter's room, meaning, nothing salacious, that people would exchange ideas or tick each other off or insult each other while they were passing each other in the men's room, and that would affect policy more than anything that we could do as conscious policymakers. And of course, speechwriters aren't supposed to be policymakers, but it did kind of fall to us because there was a vacuum.
Well, it had become such a thing under Reagan. Well, Peggy Noonan had made it famous, I suppose, with her memoir,
Right.
and the others were well known. Some of the speechwriters became well known, I guess.
Yeah, this was right after Peggy's magnificent book had come out. And it is a magnificent book, but it's also something slightly uneasy making about it for anybody who's works around a president or a politician, which is that you really ought to keep your mouth shut about what happened in terms of who wrote what and that kind of
I mean, this is another sign of, I don't know, decline may not quite be right, but let's just say change in public mores. I mean, when her book came out, I think it was the first time, maybe Stockman's book had come out too, I can't remember now. A book had been written about, not the first time, but people were shocked that someone, especially someone who was loyal and a fan of the president, had written a book about the White House, his White House, while the White House was still ongoing. I mean, in the middle of the term, at the end of the term, and that was considered, ooh, she's revealing conversations and all this sort of thing. I mean, now it seems so quaint to even worry about that. Right? People quit, and really even Bob Gates or serious, distinguished public servants who I don't think had simply money-making goals. I'm sure that was a little bit of it, and or settling scores type goals. No one really said much when Gates's book came out in the middle of Obama's presidency about conversations he had had with President Obama. And everyone's written those books, right? I mean, I think literally there must be half a dozen. I don't know. But that was a little shocking at the time. At least a lot of people kept quiet after the presidency. Or 10 years later or something like that, or masked their conversations with the president directly a little bit, and were somewhat cryptic about those. But to come out in the middle of a presidency and talk about how the sausage was being,
I tried to sort of trace the origins of that, and I went back to William Safire, who later became a very well-known columnist for the New York Times, who was a speechwriter plus, kind of, for Richard Nixon. And before Nixon was out of office, Safire had quit and had published a book that had an awful lot of what you would think of as privileged stuff.
And that book came out while he was still president?
Yes, I think the
as
first
Watergate
one
was on...
Yeah, I think the first one
didn't realize that.
Was in 73, and then he wrote another one called Before the Fall, which really, I mean, he threw all caution to the winds. And then, James Fallows wrote a piece, who was a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, spilling the beans about Carter, and actually quite negative about Carter. And under Reagan, there were more than you could count. David Stockman and Donald Regan, who had been this chief of staff for Reagan, wrote a very insulting book about the president while he was still in office. And, it's just, I still don't think, whether it's common or not, a lot of awful things are common in the world, and that's one of the awful things. I just don't think that you can do that. And Clinton had a ton of them, too. And some of them are very good books. As I said about Peggy's book, George Stephanopoulos wrote a book that actually I wrote a long piece about in the Standard, which is just dazzling in a way, about a young man being introduced to real power for the first time, and they tell me that he wrote it himself. But anyway, it's a fantastic book, but it is so damaging to Clinton, and it came out, I think, right after Clinton had been reelected. But a wonderful book, but kind of a low motive, I think.
You mentioned that President Bush, the first President Bush, was from the Yankee background and modest, but also, of course, from the World War II generation. And I think a theme of a lot of your writing has been the sort of generational differences between the greatest generation, as it was dubbed, and us baby boomers, who've had, 3 straight presidencies after George H.W. Bush, and now with Clinton versus Trump, we're speaking at the end of September. I guess it's the final revenge of the baby boomers, I think, right?
Yeah.
It should have gotten out of the way, and somehow it's...
The aging baby boomers, the last sort of grown.
Horrible. And then the millennials coming up. But say a little bit about it. You've seen this transition in Washington. I'm
not
curious.
to dwell on President Bush or my rampant fuddy-duddyism, but okay. I remember we all had a thought that something big was happening when Clinton ran. First off, the Jennifer Flowers stuff didn't really affect him. The fact that he dodged the draft quite explicitly didn't hurt him. He answered
Whereas
a question.
Quayle, if I can say from self-interest, 4 years earlier,
Dan Quayle,
had paid a price for not really dodging the draft.
Yeah, for being in the National Guard.
For being in the National Guard,
right.
Yeah.
But we just thought, this is not right. We're working for this guy who's, managed world affairs as well as you probably could, and a great war hero, and this guy who talks about his underwear on MTV. And I had that feeling most explicitly was typically the campaign for President Bush didn't want any mention of his war service because that would brand him as an old guy, as the old generation that is now passing away. And he was going to be youthful and vigorous and so on. And then immediately, as they also did often, the people at the campaign reversed course, and they decided, well, this is really a strength. And so overnight, I got a call that they had put on his schedule to come out to the Iwo Jima Memorial over in Arlington by Arlington National Cemetery to address a gathering of veterans of Guadalcanal. And
so this is 1992. So these
it
people
would have been, I think it was the 50th anniversary. I think it was 42. Guadalcanal was in 42.
Oh, so
and so
these people would be in their 70s,
yeah,
presumably, or very late 60s.
And it was the generation. That was the generation that saved the world, and so on. And overnight, I have to learn everything I can about Guadalcanal. And of course, the president had served in the Pacific. And I found this little bit of doggerel that apparently was quite common at the time among the troops: say a prayer for your pal on Guadalcanal, because the word of the carnage had come through to everybody. Everybody knew what was going on, even though communications were terrible. So anyway, I had that as like the last line of the speech. And Bush had this thing where he would say, especially at war events earlier in his presidency, he said, "Don't make me cry. I don't think I'm giving away anything bad. This has been written about before."
He would say privately to you, to the speechwriters.
Yeah. Don't, I tear up. I get very emotional about this. Do not write things that will make me cry. He was humorous about it, but so I was really skirting the edge with this "say a prayer for your pal on Guadalcanal" thing. But he got it out, and it was this sea out by the Iwo Jima Memorial, the huge lawn. It was this sea of old fat guys in Hawaiian shirts on little folding chairs, lawn chairs that they'd all brought, and they had picnic baskets and stuff. And I thought, here's the last World War II president, and these are the guys that he actually, he was in the Pacific and flew in the Pacific. And it was terribly moving to me. And then we went back to we drove back to the White House afterwards, and there was something, I can't remember explicitly what it was. I think maybe Clinton had just been on Arsenio Hall, which was a popular talk show at the time, playing Jailhouse Rock or something on his saxophone. Heartbreak Hotel, I guess. Anyway, and shades and stuff. And I was thinking, okay, this is the United States. They've got this guy, this World War II hero, or they can have this guy who talks about his underwear and plays ridiculous music on late night TV. And of course, I know who they're going to choose. And of course, I was totally wrong. But you did have this sense that, okay, something has shifted now with the baby boomers coming in. And the standards, whether higher or lower, the standards were different.
And the person, this is sort of more of a historical curiosity, but in every subsequent campaign since then, the person with with no military service or less military service, if you want to call it that, or less maybe serious military service, has won the presidency. So Dole, of course, an extraordinary, war record, and the wounds and coming back, and the personal courage that took, and the dignity with which he bore himself. Nothing. Clinton clobbered him.
Right.
2000, Gore, not huge, but did serve in Vietnam. Kerry in 2004, a little more than George W. Bush, who was stateside in the National Guard. They both lost to Bush. And then, of course, McCain was kind of the culmination of that, I suppose, for me, against Obama. And some people like us kept thinking, okay, well, he'll get some credit for what he did.
And people, when they actually sit down and think about it, they're going to go for somebody who has done something substantive and brave and courageous in his life over somebody who, played the saxophone in the high school band and ran for student council president, all that sort of stuff.
So we have no Vietnam president. I was saying, McCain, I said, of course, that's not greatest generation, that's the next generation. His father had been an admiral, I think, in World War II. But being a Vietnam POW and the courage they said, that was sort of the last, I'd say, not to take anything away from people who fought since then, but the last sort of moment in American history where there's just sort of a huge recognition of amazing courage by
Yeah.
many, many people, really. And when they came back, I remember that, and
Oh, absolutely.
flew back in '73 and stuff. And McCain was not quite the leader. I guess Stockdale maybe was, but one of the prominent people, of course, of that.
Yeah, and partly because of his great story, which was they wanted to let him go. The North Vietnamese
His
wanted to
father
let him
was
go
so
because his
famous.
father was head of the naval operations in the Pacific at the time, and he wouldn't do it. So they hung him by his broken arms for weeks on end because he wouldn't let him go.
Yeah.
I mean, you just kind of, don't we owe a guy like that something? If he wants to be president, let him be president.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe you could argue.
Maybe not, you're right,
You know,
exactly.
it's a job for 4 years. You want the person who agrees with you or whatever. I don't really begrudge
No, and
people.
I don't necessarily think he would have been a great president.
Right,
at
but
all.
it is still a little amazing how little credit. And I do think
Yeah,
Bush
yeah.
Clinton was really a moment in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
End of the Cold War, there's just a lot going on in that.
And the economy hadn't been great, and people wanted something fresh.
Yeah, it is amazing. You know, I always say that I went to work for Vice President Quayle at the beginning of the Bush-Quayle administration, and Bush had been elected, I think, with 54% of the vote. And after 4 years of my hard work, Bush exited with 38%. It is amazing how much the collapse was. And of course, you and I felt it in '92 on a campaign that was flailing around. But it's, to be fair, it's easy to flail around, or hard not to flail around, when you're just in this kind of bad environment. It's just everything goes wrong, and then you try to compensate. And you're always
I had
like,
sympathies for the guys who were running the campaign.
yeah,
They
it's
didn't know
hard
what the hell was going on.
when the wind's
And-
against you.
Yeah, and they thought the way I was just saying. I mean, they thought, well, people will come around,
Right.
you know. But
So our generation, the baby boomers, were you ever friendly to your own generation? I always say
no, I've always been a self-hater.
Yeah, me too.
Self-hating baby boomer, and that was part of it. And I mean, that experience in the White House, I kind of always, I'd like to not admit this, but it is true. I've always kind of borne a semi-personal thing about Clinton. There used to be and Clinton does have a unique, or did what seemed unique at the time, capacity to drive people crazy.
So you became a conservative at a young. I mean, when I met you, you were already a conservative, but you were already then an adult.
Yeah,
so to
I
speak.
was my parents were Republicans, and so that always, I think, pretty much everybody comes home eventually. So it may have been preordained, but I was quite self-conscious, lefty in college and graduate school. I ran the Eugene McCarthy for President campaign in California in 1976. And nobody remembers that he ran in 1976.
I was about to say, as you started to say that
It's great.
sentence, I thought, well, you were too young to have been involved in '68 because you're young, you know.
No, it was
It was
76.
76. So that was the nostalgia for McCarthy, as the sort of, that's funny.
Yeah.
I forgot about
I
that.
should say it was the student part of the campaign. It wasn't so I'd have to go and recruit people. And
This was at Berkeley, or?
no, this was in Southern California.
Oh, in
at
Southern
Occidental
California, I forgot,
College. And
Should have been at Berkeley.
I retained great affection for Gene McCarthy all the way to his dying day, and still do. But so I was very serious about my leftism, and I went to graduate school. One of the things that really started to push me over was I went to graduate school then in Berkeley.
Yeah, that's why I thought
And
Berkeley,
and Berkeley was a place where the left had gotten everything it wanted, and every crazy idea that ever went through any left-winger's idea had been enacted as policy by the city government, and the place was a mess. I mean, I remember talking to my poor landlord. I had
What are we, in the late 70s now? Or
early 80s,
Early
late
80s.
70s, early 80s. My landlord explained what it was like to be a property owner in Berkeley, and there were homeless people, obviously treated terribly everywhere, couldn't have any access to services. Anyway, it was just, I thought, well, if this is what they're aiming at, I don't think I want to sign on to this. And there were various other things that happened. And then also, when I was at Berkeley, I came across the American Spectator magazine, which at the time was kind of like a right-wing New York Review of Books or something, except for the humor. It had this, R. Emmett Terrell was the editor, and it had just this marvelous, lively, slashing humor bursting out of every page. So it was like very high culture on one hand, and then this kind of buffoonery on the other. That's not quite the right word. Satirical edge. And I just thought, hey, you know what? You can be a right-winger, which I never wanted to be, and still retain your sense of humor and still, in fact, not just retain a sense of high intellectual standards. That was kind of the essence of the thing. Because I was at Berkeley, where you could.
But you were in
kind of
grad school,
see,
right? Just to
yeah,
be clear,
yeah. Mm-hmm. You could see the collapse of intellectual standards. It was when people were just Lacan and Foucault and Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse and all these crackpots were still revered, and you know they had. I thought, geez, these people have really abandoned the sense that you can learn from the past, or that there is some kind of human reservoir of wisdom that we can draw on from the ancients, and so on. They just abandoned all that, and I thought it looks like these conservatives are the ones who are really trying to retain that, hold on to that sense of intellectual humility and appreciation for the past in Western civilization. So after I kind of crossed that thing, where it was no longer to me kind of socially undesirable to be a right-winger, then I was a goner.
And how did you, and then what?
Well, then I decided to go to another graduate school. There's all kinds of graduate schools that I never completed a degree at. But I went to a journalism graduate school, as it happened in Bloomington, Indiana, where the American Spectator was headquartered, where it had been founded by R. Emmett Terrell. And I wrote a profile of him for a magazine, a freelance piece. And I got to know him, and then he offered me a job, and I thought, well, why am I in journalism school when I've got the dream job? I get to be an editor at this wonderful magazine. So
you started at the Spectator.
It was my last journalism. I mean, my last graduate school.
And well, that's good. Yeah.
I finally pulled myself away.
And you started at the Spectator in Bloomington.
Yeah.
And then came to Washington.
Right, in '85, I think the magazine moved to Washington, and I stayed with it for another 3 or 4 years, and met my wife there, and it was a wonderful community of people, and that's sort of what the conservative movement was to me at the time. It's just these really wonderful people.
Well, let's talk about the conservative movement, since that's such a you've been in it as much as one could be in it when you're a journalist, also writing about it, and often writing critically or amusingly about it. But I don't know everyone these days is in despair. We've produced Donald Trump. This is what 30 years or 50 years, 60 years since Bill Buckley has come to, and I don't know, is that fair? I sort of did it? What's your sense?
It was probably, well, again, my fuddy-duddyism. You mentioned Buckley. Buckley was famous for his purges, where he would, get rid of the running National Review. He would get rid of John Birch Society, the anti-Semites, racists, and just pushed them out the door as a way of sort of purifying the movement. But he was also purifying. He wanted to maintain intellectual standards. You couldn't really be a smart, educated person and be a Bircher. It just wasn't, or an anti-Semite, or racialist, as they called him back then. And he wanted the conservative movement to be a repository of just what I was talking about, of the an appreciation for Western civilization, and it was becoming the last redoubt, as I say. And I think perhaps inevitably, when conservatism sort of won, when conservatism collided with political power, it had to dumb itself down. It's just the nature of politics. You have to have a broad base. And so, where Buckley had great world-class intellectuals like James Burnham or Wilmore Kendall, we now have Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly. And he had a political consultant named Cliff White, who is a genius in politics and maintained very high standards. Now you have the kind of people we have running politics now in the Republican Party. As I say, maybe it's inevitable, and I don't know what the point is in boo-hooing about it.
Right. And real things were accomplished, right? I mean, I think conservatives were right about the big issues, a lot of the big issues, not all the big issues.
No, I think the country is a better place because of what happened, and because of the political success of conservatives going all the way through the end of the century. I mean, Gingrich, for all the energy I've expended sort of poking fun at him, those guys really did real things in collaboration with Clinton, and the country's better for it.
You know, I'm interested. Just I'd say that I'm a little older than you, and so some of us
Quite a bit older, actually.
Thank you. Yes, and we were influenced. And Buckley was actually the first real conservative I'd ever read, and then of course my father into neoconservatives and so forth. But it's interesting that you came to it somewhat later through the American Spectator. Were there I'm just curious, particular authors, or either historical or contemporary, who made you picked up this American Spectator? Was there one person who jumped out? Or
Yeah. Oh, well, Bob Tyrrell himself, really because of his ability to combine humor and ideas, and a kind of fearlessness that he had was really very inspiring to me. But, you know, you're an editor at a magazine like that, it becomes kind of a graduate school, because you are, what's thrown in your face every day is some new topic, and with the demand to deal with it intelligently and amusingly and so on. And so you just learn stuff every day. And it was so much better than real graduate school. So there were great writers at the Spectator back then. My first boss at the Spectator actually was Malcolm Gladwell, who's now famous for all those things he's famous for. But Tom Bethel was a wonderful writer. The Washington correspondent Fred Barnes used to do a critique of the press every month. John O'Sullivan was the great British journalist. We had a lot of wonderful British journalists, and all British journalists have a kind of fluency, which can also quickly tilt over into BSing. But they were just a delight to read, like Shirley Robin Letwin, who was a historian, and Colin Welch, who was a journalist, Peregrine Worsthorne. So it was a great privilege to read people like that. And that all led me into reading other great journalists who weren't around anymore, like, of course, the ubiquitous Orwell, who should be everybody's role model. I actually think he's one of those people who's loved and worshipped by almost everybody and actually deserves it. But I started reading Your Father and the Buckley, who I'd known of course, because he was so famous from television. Anyway, there were just to me it was a whole world, an intellectual feast, kind of opening up in front of me.
I think I hope that's what a good magazine can do to its readers, not just to the editors. Particularly a good place to be, since you get to deal with the people, of course. But reading introduces you to people who then themselves introduce you to other people by who they quote and cite and write about, right? I think that's a very important.
I think the first thing I read 1984 in high school, I think, but the first way I encountered Orwell was reading a piece about him in Harper's by Norman Podhoretz.
Oh, wow.
So Norman, who's a writer I greatly esteem, opened the door to Orwell, and then from Orwell you go into...
This was probably in or right before 1984, as I remember there's a whole spate of Orwell commentary since this book
Norman
had been called 1984, obviously.
Yeah, but Norman kicked it off, I think, by claiming him for the neoconservative cause, which was quite controversial. I remember Christopher Hitchens wrote a particularly vicious response.
And then 20 years later, Christopher was writing for the Weekly Standard.
Exactly.
We were all on the same side in foreign policy. It's funny how the world.
It's funny how Christopher Hitchens worked, not just the world.
He was a talented journalist, though.
Probably the greatest of my time.
You really think so? Yeah.
Well, in terms in terms of the fluency and the range.
Yeah.
The sense of provocation that he always had, and it wasn't just trolling, as they say nowadays. I mean, he was just intellectually provocative, and large element of BS to it, but that's journalism for you. So.
And literary. I've always think the best journalists often have a lot of both appreciation of literature and knowledge of literature. I mean, Hitchens can recite hundreds of lines of poetry. That's a particular thing, that British thing, I think, or something. I don't know. But
well, our great friend Joseph Bottom can do that too, and he also has the same kind of fluency and eloquence that Hitchens had. And he's an American, by God.
I know. I once ended up this was a big mistake, on a panel with the two of them. Do you remember this? I don't think you were on it. At AEI, it was on sort of your favorite poetry or favorite poetry for children. And I don't know. They probably put me on because I was editing the magazine, so someone thought
sucking up.
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, it was hard. I mean, I dutifully found 3 poems I could read that we liked reading to our kids, and I think Susan basically told me what they were, since she actually has all the literary taste and had read them to the kids. And so I did my thing. But they just, of course, recited verses or stanzas of Kipling or Tennyson or whatever, and some of which was for children, and some of which was appropriate for children, though not for children.
Yeah.
I mean, it was embarrassing.
Well, the really
humiliating
impressive
being
thing
on with
about
them.
it was kind of intimidating. The great thing about Hitchens was that he could do it stone drunk too.
Yes.
After my second cocktail, I tend to forget things, but if anything, it revived him. So.
I'm just curious while we're on the topic of recommending read so much of earlier essayists. You have real appreciation and taste for that genre. I mean, who should, if someone asked you, who should I read to become a good essay? Not for the purpose of becoming an essayist myself, perhaps, but to understand what it is to write a great essay or be a great journalist. I do think that's the best way, don't you think, to become a good writer, is to read good writers. My father always said that. And
Saul Bellow has a great line, which is, a writer is a reader moved to emulation. That is, you read something and you think, I want to be able to do that someday. And I had that experience with a lot of people. I mentioned the old New Yorker writers like E.B. White, who still repays reading many of his essays. But all these people are journalists, so a good 80% of what they do is dross. It's the nature of the beast. But E.B. White wrote some essays that are just models of kind of modesty and fluency and just a kind of tastefulness of expression. A.J. Liebling, who wrote on a whole range of things. I'm always drawn to writers who aren't humorists. I would hate to think of anybody ever calling me a humorist, but humor is always close by when you're reading it. There's always a twist at the sentence that kind of just gives a little spin of humor and lightheartedness to it, and I'm always drawn to people like that.
Yeah, well, you do it yourself so well. But Liebling, White, anyone else? Orwell?
The Brits, Orwell, of course. Like Max Beerbohm, who is really wonderful. G.K. Chesterton, that's sort of because of the religious angle, I guess. He can be quite irritating, as can Beerbohm, because they were so good at what they did that it's almost, there's an offhand quality to it, and they're just...
and they wrote an amazing amount, or at least Chesterton did.
Chesterton, it's really unbelievable how much he wrote. And after you read enough of it, you see what tricks he's deploying. And but tricks are part of the game too.
And it's high quality. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yeah. But Chesterton's thing was irony. And you get through some of those essays or a book, and it's like you are so sick of irony, and paradox. It's like no more paradox.
Right.
I get it. I guess. So.
Right. Those paradoxes are a little, and they are formulaic after a while, of course, but they're still striking, and many of them are very.
Oh yeah, they're very aphoristic and wise.
Enlightening. Yeah. You mentioned that this was your grad school and a better grad school, the magazines, and I feel the same way. Having left the academy, sort of learned more, I think, than I would have, I hope, maybe, than if I'd stayed in the academy. I mean, serious scholars learn stuff in a different way, of course, but I wasn't ever going to be that, I realized at some point. But
yeah, me too.
What about the academy, though? Obviously, it's been something that's been on your mind for a long time. You wrote the Crazy You book a few years ago. I mean, how...
Well, I wanted to be an academic at one time, and I finally, when I was at Berkeley, and I dropped out because I realized that I would never get a job. So that was my first objection to academia, was that they weren't going to hire me.
A very good one, I think. Yeah, all right.
But, we again, the fuddy-duddyism, the decline in the standards there, which is what I think I perceived in the late 70s and early 80s, and people abandoning a defense of the best that's been thought and said, as Matthew Arnold put it, has had just long-lasting consequences. I think, again, we go back to Trump. People talk about how, especially liberals will talk about, oh my God, can you imagine this country would actually have someone like this as their president? Well, the country has now been in the hands of a public school system that has been owned by liberals for almost 3 generations. And going back to John Dewey, if you want to say that. And this is what happens. People are, when you rob them of the intellectual defenses that education used to arm people with in terms of civics and history, when you strip that away, you're going to be able to be much more susceptible to demagogues like Trump.
No, that's really an important point, I think. And I would say, wouldn't you say at the higher ed level, it's the academy, which is dominated by liberals, obviously, of various stripes, who have legitimated and praised and held up for emulation a bunch of either frauds or
mediocrities
or fluent mediocrities or fashionable
yeah.
types. And also, once you do that for 20, 30, 40 years, I do find it wonderful for these liberal scholars to be suddenly, or so-called scholars, liberal academics, to be suddenly appalled at Trump. The people they're writing nice reviews about
well, exactly.
are, not quite Trump, but they're somewhat con men in their own way, right?
Yeah. I mean, in their self-flattery, I'm sure they would point out that, the higher your education level, the more the support for Trump drops, which is true, but it doesn't negate the point you're making, which is the people who are lionized in the academy now, and the kind of people who have the power to intimidate academics, really are not impressive intellectually. It's not about intellectual achievement as much as it is about fashion, appearing sensitive, so on. Things that aren't particularly
postmodern cleverness of a certain type.
Again, lots of irony. They're just not as good as Chesterton, I don't think.
I know, isn't that funny? Yeah. That's partly because they're liberals, I think, or progressives, right?
Mm-hmm.
A little hard for progressives to be ironic if you have to earnestly labor to make the world better. Chesterton was not a big...
Right. No, Puritans are never real laugh-meisters.
No, and this, of course, reminds me of Alan Bloom's great book, which you wrote an introduction to the reissue of it, or...
Yeah, the 25th anniversary.
I guess that's right. So it came out in 87, so that would have been 2012. And did that book strike you at the time in 87? Or?
Yeah, I was actually... There's a funny story about that. I was at the American Spectator, and I didn't know who Alan Bloom was. And we got a manuscript over the transom from, I think, Simon & Schuster, saying, would you like to publish some part of this manuscript? And it was called Souls Without Longing was the title. Fantastic title. And we had a disagreement in the office. I took it home one night. I was like, okay, well, it's kind of well written. It's sort of funny. Not for us. And my immediate superior, Vladi Pleszczynski, one of the greatest editors I've ever met, wanted to take out a chapter about rock and roll, in which there's all these insults thrown at Mick Jagger, who I quite liked at the time, and other things. It was talking about fuddy-duddyism. I just thought, we can't run this. This is just like too fuddy-duddy. So we rejected it.
Is that right?
Yeah, and they wanted the manuscript back. I mean, it was a Xerox copy of it, and you had to send it back. And then within a year, it was one of the biggest sellers of the 1980s. It was at the top of the bestseller list for, I don't know, 2 months or something. No one could have foreseen that, I say, in my defense. But then years later, I was asked to write an introduction to the reissue, and as any reader who's looked at it will see, I resisted the temptation to mention that story that I had once rejected the.
You should take credit for that. That's good. My father has an account of when he was at Encounter magazine in '56, I think it was. Rejecting Michael Oakeshott's classic essay on rationalism and politics for complicated reasons, actually. No, he appreciated also that it was an excellent essay, of course.
Yeah.
But it's like the best essay, anyone's ever rejected. But Bloom was rejecting an excerpt of Bloom is also, that's pretty impressive.
Your father wasn't apologetic about that decision.
No.
I think he still thinks he did the right thing.
Correct.
I realized that I really blew it.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, you could, maybe he really, I don't know what he really thought, and maybe it's just a brave face there. No, but he has an explanation for at least why he thought Oakeshott was not right for them at that time.
Yeah, right.
That's what we say in the magazine business when you want to reject something and you don't want to have to get into a long discussion of why it doesn't quite fit or you don't agree with it. It's not quite right for us.
Not quite right for us.
It's really an excellent phrase that I learned.
And it's good to say right now, because then people
good.
think like, oh, so I have a future.
Yeah, that's really nice. Lead them on that way.
Right. Exactly. Lead them on.
So you then wrote an excellent book about higher ed about 20, 25 years after Bloom, but for the different focus, not so much the intellectual problems, but more the institutions themselves, right?
Yeah, and
Admissions
particularly admissions, and it's more sort of pop sociology than it is a critique of intellectual trends or anything.
but very revealing about the institutions, in my opinion, of higher ed, the
Yes.
actual how they work, the business of
yeah.
higher ed, so to speak. More,
Yeah. The further you get into it, the absurdity, quite apart from intellectual standards and so on, the absurdity of these institutions is just manifest, unavoidable. The way they've given themselves over to marketers and the kinds of tricks that they'll play on really undeserving young people. The whole huge edifice that is designed to do nothing but get people to borrow money so that they can buy a product that is demonstrably not worth what they say it is. They would disagree with that, but there are reasons why I think I'm right on that. Two things about college. One is people who graduate from it don't really learn a lot. That's clearly been demonstrated. And it costs too much. Now, how you put those two things together, you have a failed product that sells at an inflated price, and that everybody is under tremendous social pressure to gain access to. And so that in itself is something for a journalist. It's just like really worth writing about.
And you had some great experiences talking to admissions officers. And who's that? The consultant who helps you pay a ton to? I mean, you don't.
Yeah.
One pays a ton to in New York City, I think it was.
Yeah.
Who gets you into college, gets your kids into college.
Did a little profile in there about a woman who, at the time, was charging $40,000 for a soup to nuts program for your kid, to get your kid into one of the top 3 schools of his or her choice. And the catch to that is that she helps the child pick the top 3 schools, and so it's kind of can't lose for her. But it was a perfect example of the kind of insanity that had gone on. The idea, whatever, $40,000 now would probably be $55,000. So somebody's making too much money if they're willing to throw that kind of dough at somebody just to get into Harvard, Stanford. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, you actually can demonstrate that there is a correlation to future earnings and so on. But it's also well demonstrated that where you go to college has no relationship to future happiness, earning power, life satisfaction. All those sorts of things are just not related to the school that parents drive themselves crazy to try and get into.
I guess the sorting process, though, and the prestige is just people do believe it gives their kid.
Yeah, it's a kind of insanity, and they believe. I think if you go to Harvard, nothing against Harvard, that you have life wired in a way that you might not otherwise.
Right.
If you go
Which is a mixed blessing, though, since it maybe doesn't. You learn better lessons about life going to
you might,
University of Michigan or something.
Yeah, but if you go to University of Illinois versus DePaul or Purdue, there's no difference in your life. I mean, you're going to have different friends, of course, but in terms of something that is really determinative of what your life is going to be, it's just not there.
So is it a bubble, as our friend, a lot of people want to say, or can this thing just go on forever?
It's got to be. You can't have, you can't have inflated prices like this and a kind of inelastic demand without sooner or later somebody figuring out a way to puncture the bubble. And I think it's already happened. The rate of increase in tuitions is leveling off now, and that it's not quite a burst bubble. And people are going to figure out alternatives. The real importance of a college degree, the sociological importance of it, is that it's a signaling mechanism. It says, okay, I got a degree, which means I can wake up in the morning. It tells an employer certain things about you, and that's continues to be valuable. But the question is, can somebody else come up with an idea to make the same signaling happen without forcing parents to pay $200,000? And I'm sure that will happen sooner or later.
And once, don't you think, someone breaks, I guess this is happening already, the cartels manage ability to say you need 4 years.
Right.
which is ludicrous, really. And once you say, well, 3 years and a couple of summers, or actually 2.5 years and one summer, and some extra courses taken at night, and I think that there'll be huge pressure, I should think, and there already is, I suppose, on school. That's
Yeah.
just pure money. I mean, in the sense that
Yeah.
paying for 3 years tuition is a lot less than paying for 4 years tuition.
Right. Well, but that goes to the confusion that may be at the very heart of the whole thing, which is we don't know what we want from higher education. I mean, do we want to, familiarize our children with the best that's been thought of and said, and turn them into good citizens, and spiritually developed, intellectually developed, or do we want to set them up to get a good job?
Right.
And as long as those, most schools, especially small liberal arts schools, were set up and designed to do the first task and not the second task, but there's more and more a utilitarian view of what education is, higher education. Parents want something for all that money they're putting out. They want to make sure that their kids get a good job, which is a different thing from what these places were designed to do.
And do you think it's a big I kind of go back and forth in this in my own mind. Is it a big problem for America that we have this big, expensive, time and money wasting and often foolish higher education establishment? Foolish, I would say, and it's the views it tends to encourage kids to have, and how they should spend years 18 to 22 and so forth. Or is it just like we're a very rich country? The kids are going to do something between ages 18 and 22. They're going to go. They'll be messing
Might as well
around
go get drunk and
in a dorm where there's someone vaguely watching out for them as opposed to somewhere else, and and maybe
Yeah.
they'll have one good teacher, and it's not the worst thing in the world. I don't know. I can go.
Well, I'm not really a Pollyanna about it. I mean, we are a rich country. However, this is a lot of wasted money.
Yeah.
A lot of money thrown down the drain. These are huge, bloated institutions that, as I say again, demonstrably fail at what they're supposed to do. And that can't be healthy for a country. Right. And the other thing I'd say is the matter of debt. The idea that you have this responsible people who are taking kids and telling them, don't worry about the money. You'll be able to borrow the money. Just go to college. Just go to college and we'll take care of the money. And that is a terrible life lesson for people, quite apart from the practical difficulties that they face when they graduate and they've got, $90,000 of debt to pay off.
And they're not learning much, maybe, and not learning good, important things. Now, how much people ever learned is an interesting question. You, as you say, sort of feel like you got a lot of your education post-college and post-grad school, for that matter.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe that's always been the case,
Well,
really. But
a friend of mine, I quote in the book, had an interesting thing about Harvard, actually. He said, Harvard is very proud of its diversity now and how it creates a class and, has an oboe player here and a transsexual baccarat champion and, all of that sort of strange considerations that they used to put it together a class. But he said, strangely enough, in the 1930s, you probably had more diversity at Harvard than you do now. Now, they're all achievers. They're all people who have learned how to suck up. And nothing against Harvard people again, but who have learned how to manage the tricks of getting ahead. Back in the 1930s, you had drunkards, you had blue bloods who weren't very smart, you had real go-getters, you had great athletes, and so on. And
eccentric intellectuals.
Yeah,
much more.
And that's a genuine kind of variety. Harvard doesn't have that kind of variety now, I don't think.
I do think one of the worst things about the modern academy is sort of the opposite of in a way, or the flip side of the normal critique, or let's say middle American critique, which is true also, that it's a bunch of, people who don't know anything about the real world and full of, they fall in love with these abstract ideas and they indoctrinate the kids and all that. That's also true. But the other problem of it is the opposite. It is full of now very conventional, certainly students who are thought to be strivers, and academics who are extremely conventional in their views and disciplinary, oriented towards achieving things in their discipline. And I sort of feel like when I was in school was the very end of the eccentric genius professors. But you don't find many of them anymore with their own quirks and oddball interests and willing to advance very heterodox theses that shake up some discipline, even if it's a very exotic discipline, like, I don't know, like Roman history or something,
When I would go around and talk to professors, one of the dominant emotions I felt emanating from them was a kind of fear that you really can't step out of line. And for example, the school I went to, Occidental College, which is a little liberal arts school, has now become irredeemably politicized. It is essentially a place for propagandizing young people in leftist politics. When I went there, it was, you had a lot of kind of crackpot professors, but they could recite Hamlet backwards, and I still remember being in some of those classes and having this sense of intellectual thrill. I mean, it was thrilling to be able to hear somebody talk about Midsummer Night's Dream in ways that had just never occurred to me before. I wonder now at a place like Occidental or other schools that are reputed to offer an intellectual experience, does anyone ever get thrilled anymore? Does anybody ever have these vistas open up to them? Or do they think, okay, America is this, and politics should be handled this way, and race means this, and I just don't think that there's room for that now.
Yeah, and in addition to the political correctness, I guess there's also the more disciplinary focus of all the disciplines: history, political science, literature. So you're going to fill in this gap, or you're going to modify this thesis a little bit by showing something. And I do think it just seems much more conventional and less daring. I mean, I remember auditing a class on Roman history. I mean, I knew nothing about Roman history, but I vaguely sensed, and the professor said this, that he was challenging the mainstream interpretation, and he had a totally opposite interpretation or something. And I don't remember what it was, and I was totally incapable, obviously, of judging this. And I didn't really do the reading or took the course. I just sat in a few lectures. But it was exciting, and I think the example of someone willing to just say for 50 years this whole understanding has been wrong, and let's look at it the opposite way, and here's what I'm basing it on, and here's my interpretation of this speech of Cicero or something, I can't remember. I mean, it is I don't know, I worry that you do learn, even if you don't learn anything concrete from that. I know nothing about Roman history today as well. You do maybe get a little taste of what real intellectual challenging of orthodoxy is, which I'm not sure people get today.
I haven't seen evidence of it in what I did. I'm sure that there are places where that is encouraged and where it happens, and I think we really can overstate the degree to which political correctness has infiltrated that. In my experience with my kids, when you got to a serious subject being taught by a serious professor, they knew enough not to indoctrinate kids. They were about actually a higher thing, and I'm sure that there's still a lot of that going on. I would say in my defense, so that people don't think I'm a complete fuddy-duddy. But I am, actually.
Yeah, so let's close on the topic of our kids' generation, the millennials, since we talked about the greatest generation, the World War II generation, and then the baby boomers. Where are we? I mean, we've got some wonderful young people at the Weekly Standard. That always cheers me up to see 24-year-olds show up and be full of interesting ideas. And many of them, though, I'd say have gotten their ideas and their education or their intellectual stimulation not from the colleges and universities.
Yeah, I've seen that
struck
too.
by that. But
I'm always heartened by the quality of people we have passing through our office, or some pass through and stay, which is wonderful.
Or even interns for the summer.
Yeah. And so that's wonderful. I do again.
So where are you on the millennials, though? Are we in agreement that there are all kinds of terrible?
It's hard to generalize. I generalize about the baby boomers because as I say, sort of a self-hater, and but the millennials, it's tough. I mean, they're obviously, if you believe polls, they're much more left-wing. They're not as well educated as people with a comparable level of education might have been 30 years ago. Those are all kind of things that are just true, and you can document and quantify. This is the thing to me that's distressing about Trump, not to beat that dead horse.
He's unfortunately a live horse, at least at this moment. Not unfortunately, I don't want him dead, but I mean, unfortunately, politically and culturally, a very live horse, right?
Yeah, and we'll no matter what happens to him, we'll leave a mark.
Yes.
I mean, I had a young person very closely related to me, in fact, telling me about, or asking me to imagine you're an 18-year-old and you're graduating from high school, about to go off to college. This is your first real presidential election year that you're paying attention to. And you look at the Republican Party and you look at that ridiculous convention that they have, and you look at the man who's leading the party. Is there any 18-year-old in America who's going to say, I want to be part of that? That I want to spend my life advancing that cause. I don't think there is. And whereas earlier, Reagan did that. Reagan said, I want to be part of that. Well, even George W. Bush and God knows, Barack Obama. People looked at that and I want to spend part of my life advancing what this guy stands for. It's just not going to happen now.
And it happened with Barry Goldwater, who got crushed. So it's not even a matter of winning or losing, really. There are a ton of people who were inspired by Goldwater as a challenger to the orthodoxy, who ended up being, including Ronald Reagan, in a way, and many young conservatives we know.
Absolutely.
A little older than we are. They're not young anymore, but they were young 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Who really got their start that way. So, that's the political side. Then there's the more sort of technological side, almost, of the millennials. I'm sort of struck by this, that, and again, it doesn't want to sound too much like a fuddy-duddy, but how much does the world of email, texting, iPhones change people's way of, a lot of it's good, and suddenly they have access to a million things, but change their way of learning, change their way of reading, make them less likely to stumble on, or not stumble, to discover Orwell and E.B. White and spend 3 weeks reading I think I once read through the 4-volume essay. People of our generation probably have this, right?
Yeah.
Of Orwell's essays.
Yeah, Harcourt Brace, I think.
Yeah, which must have been done, after he died, but the 50s or 60s, I suppose.
60s, I think, or early 70s.
And it was sort of everyone our age, not everyone, many people our age who wanted to think of themselves as someone intellectual had that 4 volumes. And a lot of people read a lot of it, or dipped into it at least. And I don't know, do people do that anymore?
Endlessly amusing. Well, I've actually... They're hard to get hold of, but I've gotten hold of several sets and given them to young people as a standard, because I found such inspiration in that. This is kind of intellectual clarity and hygiene that he embodied. But I'm kind of, what strikes me most about the wonders of digital technology and the internet, which is just so wonderful on so many levels, is that it's ended the practice of, or the phenomenon of serendipity, which I used to get. I'd go to the library and just wander the stacks, and I'd get one book, but then I'd look down the aisle and there was this or that, and you could end up sitting on the floor and reading for 2 hours of a book you'd never thought of when you went in. Now, because it is so efficient to find things, which is again marvelous, you don't stumble on things as much. Now, I may be wrong about that. There may be people, especially millennials, who will say that you're on Facebook and things happen to you that you never would have anticipated. But I think in the kind of way that I'm talking about, as a kind of an intellectual, not discipline, but an intellectual matter, that we've lost that serendipity, and simply by things being so efficient now.
No, that's why I think it's important to recommend. Maybe one has to do a little more of actual recommending. It's good that you're giving people the Orwell essays and stuff.
I think I may have just reached the pinnacle of fuddy-duddyism by arguing against efficiency. I think that really I may have transcended myself now.
And the internet and the iPhone and stuff. That's good. Well, that's a good note on which to end. I think the two of us, we the pinnacle of fuddy-duddyism is what we aspire to, right?
Well, not in my better moments.
Not aspire to. It's what we end up at.
Yeah, that's where we are.
Let's be honest, right? Andy, thanks very much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining me on Conversations.